My name is Mariusz. I'm based in Poland, so cześć, dzień dobry. And today we will talk about the API security. So I will start from a poll to you. How many of you met with the API security problem in your organization already? Only Sasha, you don't count, or there is one? Okay, so not too many, yes, actually, but after this presentation, and this is my goal actually, after this presentation, I hope that you will be convinced that this is a really security problem and it's related with your organizations. Maybe not now, but for sure it will be related in the future, yes? So what is the API? API is an application programming interface. Okay, application programming interface. What does it mean for you? Yes. Maybe you heard about maybe you have a chance to configure some devices like Cisco, Checkpoint, Palo Alto, or wherever, or F5, through the REST API calls. There is a chance to configure some device just by sending API calls to this device. Yes, and this is actually the key of the API. API, this is a way, this is some structured way how to configure with some application. In this case, your application, this is your device. But if you will think more broader, you will understand that you can configure your application through the API calls. Yes, and this presentation is exactly about this change which we are observing right now, because architecture of the application is right now changing. Yes. So please keep in mind about that, and we will go through about this. So maybe you are not convinced what is the API, not all of you probably. So this is just an example of the API call. Probably most of you are using Google Earth. Yes, how many of you? Probably all of you, yeah? For sure I'm using the Google Earth. So Google Earth is just an application, yes? And you can browse to this Google Earth and you can find some satellite pictures. You can use this Google Earth for the geolocation. Yes, this is the application. But the reality and the beauty of the Google Earth is that it has an open API, yes? So what does it mean for us? It means that we can communicate with the Google Earth through the API, and we can leverage the beauty of the Google Earth. And actually, I'm just showing you some generic applications. So for instance, there is a malaria risk mapping application. There is a global forest coverage change application. So these are the third-party applications which are using the API calls through the Google Earth, and they are using the intelligence of the Google Earth to present some information by using the Google Earth intelligence, yes? And this is really unique, and this is very important, and this will have further consequences in the future. By the way, there is a nice application, Street Zombie Apocalypse. Maybe you heard about this. If you would like to see how your neighborhood will look like during the zombie attack, go visit this application. Cool. So this was an example of the API call. Yes. So then we have to go a little bit more in the technical details. So probably you heard about the SOAP API and also REST APIs. There are two different API formats. SOAP is more related with the XML format, and REST API calls they are based on the HTTP. Yes, so HTTP is used to send the API calls. Yes, and when I'm talking about the HTTP and HTTPS, probably most of you are thinking about the web application right now, which is good. Yes, and this is very tight communication between the HTTP and API call. Yes, API calls they are just transited through the HTTP or HTTP calls to the applications. So this is very important because it will open a lot of possibilities for the bad guys, for the attackers to leverage or to leverage the vulnerabilities of the API calls which are transported through the HTTP. Very important when you're talking about the REST API, this is that REST API, they are maps resources into URLs. So all the resources, they are mapped on the URLs, like you have here. So these are the URLs. And very important, if you will compare the typical HTTP, and if you would like to see or find a difference between the API call and HTTP, so the main difference is that the REST API calls, they are using also different methods like in regular HTTP. So in regular HTTP we have gets, posts, yes, normally. But REST API calls, they are using other, not only gets and posts, but they are also using other HTTP methods like post, like patch, like delete, like update, and so on. Yeah. So this is very typical. So let's go a little bit more further for the details of the REST API calls. So I choose the example of the Tesla. So if you will go for the Tesla webpage and if you will send an REST API call, and this will be a get, because this is an HTTP command, and get/vehicles, you will probably see something like that. Yes, if you have Tesla. If you don't have, you will not see this this response. But this is really unique for the REST API calls, that in the response you will receive such structure. And this is actually a JSON format. JSON is a shortcut from the words JavaScript-oriented notification or format. And what is typical for the JSON format is that in this structure you will find a pairs like parameter, color, display name, ID, option, colon, value. So these are the pairs of the parameters, colon, values. And as you can see here, because I sent this request to the Tesla, it returned to me ID 321. And I can use this fact, and this is the beauty of the REST API calls, that I can use some previously returned information and I can build other REST API calls. So this time, if I will send this GET request to the same resource vehicle, but this time /321, which is my ID of my car, Tesla car, then in the response I will receive something like that. Yes, and also I can switch or flash lights by sending the REST API call to my Tesla, actually, because this is my Tesla 301 ID, so I can flash the lights on my Tesla car. And actually there are also other methods, yes. And the beauty of the REST API call is that I can simply run some, let's say, mini program just by sending this REST API call. This is a heart and the beauty of the REST API calls. And you can ask me, okay, so from where you know which commands, which URLs you can use in your API calls. And actually, there is a Swagger or Open API call file. And this is you don't have to remember all the things here right now, but the beauty of the Swagger file is that this is a declarative definition of the API. Yes, so in this file, in the Swagger Open API file, you will find all the resources which you can leverage. You will find all the response codes. In the nutshell, you will immediately understand what for this API is and how you can play with this API. Yes. Please keep in mind about this file because I will return this. I will return to this Swagger file in the near future, and because I will show you something. Please remember about this Swagger file, about the declarative definition. So right now we know what is the API. We know that there is a REST API calls, yes, and REST API calls they can be transmitted through the HTTP or HTTPS, yes. And the problem is that right now, for many years, we are observing massive growth of the API calls on the internet. There is a huge, right now, explosion of the API calls on the internet. Yes, and we can think, what is the reason? Why this is happening? So actually, there are three main reasons. One is the break down the silos. So probably in your organization, maybe not in Eastern Europe, this trend is not happening, let's say, very oftenly like in Western Europe, but at least in Poland, probably in Slovakia, in Czech, we are observing that the DevOps guys, the DevOps community, the DevOps culture, they are starting in our organizations. So it means that they are changing our application, yes? And actually the DevOps guys, they love API. Actually, they are right now developing applications which are the group of the microservices which are communicating through the API calls. Yes, and this is one of the main reasons why we are observing massive growth of the API calls, because application architecture is right now changing. Yes, because of the DevOps guys, because of the microservices, and there is also the third reason: create new digital revenue streams. If you remind yourself the slides which I just showed you about the Google Earth, yes, you can simply understand right now that if you will open an API to your application, maybe you will have a chance to earn money. Yes, so some organizations, they are actually opening their APIs, and they are just doing this for business purposes. Yeah? So this is very important. Yes, if you have some property, if you have some, if your application is doing something really unique, yes, and the other guys, they will have to spend a lot of time to do the same, you can just simply open an API and tell them, please use my application through the API calls, but I will charge you for this. Yes, this is the beauty of the API. Okay, and speaking about the microservices, about the containerized containers, this is something that completely and drastically right now changing the world of the applications which we know. So this is just a short statistic. Almost 90% of the responders, they are thinking or they are predicting that in the next 5 years, the microservices, the containers will be a leading technology in their infrastructure. 90% of the people. And there are also other statistics, but you can let's say, not agree with me, but this is the fact. We cannot complain about that. This is happening. The DevOps community, they are actually bringing the containers to our organizations. And we need to, find a way how to secure this, yes? How to collaborate with the DevOps guys from one point, from the second point, how to secure their efforts. Yes. So as I told you, right now we are observing, and this is probably the most important part in my most important slide in my presentation. Right now we are observing that the application architecture is changing from this model where we have a, let's say, typical user which communicated with some web server through the browser, yes, and he was sending HTML or HTTP, just HTTP commands to get the data from this database. Right now, probably all of the internet calls will be API calls, and they will be in JSON format. This is the reality in which we will live in the really, really near future. And this is happening in the organizations. So we already talked about this, so let's think what are the security challenges, yes? Because I just briefly described you the beauty of the API calls, but from the other point, we need to think how to secure the API world, I would say. So basically, if I'm the, let's say, a hacker and I'm looking for a architecture of the application, I have a few chances to, let's say, to steal the data, let's say, from this database. So I can attack the endpoint device, I can attack the web server, or maybe I will find a way how to some vulnerabilities here. Yeah? But at the same time, if we are talking about the API calls, API calls, they have to be analyzed by some API gateway or API server. Yes? This part of the server is listening on the same port as web server. It doesn't have to, but most of the cases it listens on the same port. But from the hacker perspective, there is a second way or additional way how to get to the data. Yes. So other words, API, they are actually increasing the attack surface. Yes. So from the security point of view, this is really huge and important to secure also the API calls. Yes, because as I just showed you, this is another way how you can simply get to the data. Yes, and if your application is very, let's say, sophisticated, and there are many microservices which are just sending or exchanging information through the API calls, this problem is more relevant even, yes, because sometimes you can tell me, yes, this API is secured here, but maybe other API or other microservices which used also API calls to the other microservices in your application is not secure, yes. So this is really potential hole for the hacker to get to the data, to find some microservice which will use API calls and it will not be secured. Some examples. I will not go into all the details because I have only 30 minutes, so I just only will describe you very shortly. Maybe you heard about the Australian guy. Actually, he attacked Spotify and Netflix, so huge brands, yes. He attacked he sent a lot of API calls through the login page, which used the API call in the background, and he provided the credential stuffing attack. Credential stuffing attack is the attack where you are using the already leaked credentials. There is tons of leaked credential databases. Yes, so this was really simple attack. He just sent a lots of API calls with the leakage credentials, and he was trying to find the match, whether this user and password exists in the database or not. Really simple attack, but really powerful. And actually, he was catched by Australian police. Why? Because he was not so clever. Because he was publishing all this information and he was distributing this leaked or already existing Netflix and Spotify accounts on the regular web page. So this was completely stupid. But well, this was a business which he invented. And actually, when you will look for the OWASP top 10 attack vectors for the API security, you will find this. So this is from the OWASP. How many of you knows what is the OWASP? OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. Yes, they are producing the OWASP top 10 web attacks list. Yes, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and so on. But at the same time, they have many different projects. At the same time, they are also publishing the information about the automated attacks, top 10 automated attacks, and top 10 API attacks right now. Why? Because, as I told you, API is a growing problem right now. And if you look for this list, you will immediately understand that some parts of these attacks vectors are related with the authorization and authentication. Some parts of them, they are related with the access control. For sure, you will find an information or the attack vectors which are the typical content layer 7 attacks, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. And there is also visibility and reporting problem. Yes. So this is something that you should be familiar when we are talking about the web application security. And this is just to, let's say, summarize this part, because as I told you, that API calls, they are massively growing, yes? And as I told you, there is a huge problem with the API calls to secure them. According to the Gartner, the API attack or API security problem will be the main problem by 2022. The main problem internet. Yes. So that's why I told you, my goal is to convince you that this is also related with your organizations. Okay, so probably I will have to finish, but let's move on, and I will just simply describe you what is the response from our company, so F5 and NGINX. So basically, according to OWASP, you need to have application security, which should be provided by WAF, and this guy will provide the content layer 7 security. Then you should have an API gateway for the access control, and then visibility administration. Yes, and if you would like to see and understand how this should be positioned from the F5's perspective, so I hope that you know that from many years we have advanced WAF and ASM technology, which is our WAF. And the question is about the API gateway. How many of you knows that F5 is an API gateway company? You, sir. Okay. Actually, we are not an API gateway security. We are not API gateway company, but we as acquired NGINX company. Yes, and because of this, right now in F5 portfolio, you will also find an API gateway. So, in the nutshell, what it means for you, it means that we, according to the OWASP, yes, as I just presented you, F5 right now has a full portfolio to protect the API. We have WAF, we have API gateway, we have visibility, we have everything what you need to secure your API call. And just let's say I will present you some configurations how you can configure API protection on F5. So basically, on big IP, right now I will only talk about the big IP. On big IP, you can configure the guided configuration, and in the guided configuration there will be one part which will build for you an API security profile. Yes, and the beauty of this API security profile is that during the process of creating the content layer security, the advanced WAF policy and also access policy, it will ask you to import the Swagger file. And why this is important? Because as I told you, if you would like to understand how to secure the API, you need to understand what for this API is. Yes, and to understand this, to know what are the URLs, what are the methods possible for your API, what are the response codes. This is a hard work, yes, especially when the developers, they wrote some API for you, for your application, and you are just a network or security guy and you don't know anything about the API because you are not the coder, yes. And the beauty is that when you want to create a AWAF policy or access policy, Big IP will create those policies for you, but we will just simply ask you for the Swagger and Opel file. And from where you can download this file, you can just simply ask your developers, guys, I know that you are doing something with the APIs, give me a Swagger file. And for them, this is a really simple way how they will just generate a Swagger file for you, yes? And then you will have a declarative definition of the API, of the developer's API, and you can just simply import it to the Big IP. And Big IP, it will create for you the AWAF policy with all the URLs, all the methods, all the response codes, and even more, it will also, because in the response for the API call, as I told you, you will receive on the response JSONs. Yes, and at the same, you can also put the JSONs through the API calls. So it will also be, because AWAF is capable to parse the JSON format, it will also be able to leverage this fact for the API calls. And this is just simple example because Jakub gave me only 30 minutes to show you the beauty of the API security. So I've prepared a demo, but I don't have a time, of course, to present you. if you will be interested, I will stay for all the day here, so just ping me, I can show you the demo and I can explain you all the details. But how you can, first of all, how you can provide some API calls to your API application. You cannot use the browser like Chrome, like, I don't know, Mozilla, Opera, or wherever, yes? Why? Because these are not the API clients, yes? You need to use the, for instance, the tool like Postman. Postman is the API client, and by this client you can just simply send some API calls. In this case, I'm sending the post command to my API server here, and the beauty of this API call is that in one of the JSON parameter, I will send a simple simple cross-site scripting attack. Yeah? So what does it mean? It means that very important when we are talking about the API security, you need to also secure the payload of the API security. Yes, because some actually sophisticated guys, they can provide some well-known web attacks inside the API calls. Yes. So if I will send this request to my web application, you will receive the information 403 forbidden, and you will get in the response the support ID. And support ID, actually, this is the number of the incident which was created by AWAF, yes, by our WAF. In this case, if you will look for the logs for the AWAF, you will see that there was a violation, illegal meta character in value, and these are the reasons why we discovered this attack. Yeah? Cool. I will not talk about the DDoS attacks against the API calls. I will not talk about the bot attacks or automated attacks against the API applications because I don't have a time, but for sure, you have to be aware that the bad guys, for sure, they will try to send some, a lots of requests to the API servers. They will try to automate some attacks, so you need to have a way to protect such against such attacks. And of course, our WAF, our advanced WAF, is prepared to protect against automated and DDoS attacks. And this is just an example. If I will use the same Postman tool, and even if I will send an authenticated request by OAuth 2.0, but I will be really aggressive, I will send a lot of such requests, yes? Then, of course, you can configure on a 5 some policy which will rate limit all the API calls. Why? Because you would like to slow down some bad guys, because otherwise they can they can simply take down your API server. Yes, if they will send 1 million requests per minute, for instance. Yes, so your natural idea will be to actually slow them down. And you can also slow them down, or you can configure spike arrest or rate limit also on the NGINX Plus or API gateway in NGINX Plus. But I will not, because of the time, I will not talk about this right now. And also very important, because as I told you, there are 3 pillars for the API security. One was the WAF policy or WAF. Second was the API gateway or access control, yes? So how we can provide with F5 and NGINX and access control. So other words, how we can authenticate the client that he will be able to send an API calls to our application. There are different methods here. So for instance, maybe you heard about the SAML protocol. SAML, how many of you heard about the SAML? Lots of you. But SAML is quite, how to say, it's a perfect method. It's really secure method to to authenticate the user. But the problem with the SAML is that it will not scale when we are talking about the API security. So this is the first reason. And second, very important, in SAML you need to configure the trust relationship between the IDP provider and service provider. And to configure the trust relationship, you need to certificate. So this is a little bit complex, yes. And to have a authentication for the really fast API calls, you need to use some modern technique, some more elastic technique than SAML. And one of the technique is, or authentication protocol is OAuth 2.0. How many of you heard about the OAuth? About the OAuth 2.0? Okay, some. Okay. I don't have a time to explain all the beauty of this technology. The beauty of this technology that in the nutshell it used the OpenID, and OpenID actually it used the JWT tokens. And the JWT tokens are really fantastic when we are talking about the API security. Why? Because in JWT token, you will receive all the information about the credentials, but at the same time, the JWT token is self-signed. So you don't have to have, all the CA infrastructure or the PKI infrastructure to generate the certificates and things like that. Because JWT token, which is used by OpenID and OAuth, is self-signed. Yes, just for the records. You can configure the API key on the NGINX Plus basis, but the beauty, and I will encourage you to use actually for the to provide the access control. I will encourage you to use the authentication or authorization with the federation. What does it mean? It means so. If we have an API client or application which will send some API calls to our application here, we can simply authenticate this guy by sending his request to IDP, to or OAuth provider or identity provider. We have different kinds of the OAuth providers. So this could be an Okta, this could be Azure, or wherever. Also F5 could be an IDP provider. So the beauty of this technology is, if we don't know this guy, and this guy doesn't have any account in our application, he will be redirected to one of the IDP providers. Then it will have to authenticate in this site. And those guys, they will send a JWT token, as we discussed. And because this JWT token is self-signed, we don't have to, build a trust relationship with the other parties, because the JWT token is everything what we need. Yes. In this JWT token, there will be an information about this guy, about the credentials of this guy, and whenever we will see this JWT token, we can configure on F5, or you can also configure the OAuth profile also on the NGINX Plus. It's up to you. Yes, and sometimes you will see that because we acquired the NGINX, and sometimes you will see that you can configure almost the same features on F5, I mean on the big IP, and at the same time you can also configure the same features on NGINX. And the question is, which technology I should use? Yes, and my answer to you is it depends on your application. Yes, if you have a developers, if you have a DevOps guys, they naturally would like to use NGINX. Why? Because what they are doing is in declarative way. So they love actually the YAML file, the JSON file, where you have where you will have configuration of your features. Yes. So it really depends. If you're a network or security guy and you are familiar with F5, then you can configure authentication here. Or, as I told you, if you're a DevOps guys, more related with the DevOps organizations or DevOps community, you can use the NGINX Plus. It's up to you. But I will definitely encourage you, first of all, to use the OAuth, which is, I believe, in these days, the preferred way how you can authenticate and authorize the API client or API application. And this is just an example. If I was sent by the postman, which is my API client, if I will send an OAuth 2.0 or authenticated API call to my API server, if this is really authenticated user, then I will receive 200 OK. So it means that this guy presented to my API gateway or F5. As I told you, it depends whether you want to configure this on F5 or Nginx Plus. But the key point is that this guy presented some JWT token. This is it here, and I get this JWT token from the identity provider. Yes, this is the beauty of this technology. Okay, the last part is the visibility and the reporting. Very important. Yes, without the visibility, there is no security. Yes, if you are not aware what is happening, what kind of API calls your devices are processing, how many of them they were unauthenticated, how many of them they were authenticated, how many attacks we have seen in the payload or in the just requests. Yes, so this is very important, and Big IP with the dashboard for the API calls will provide you all the information, and of course you will find information in the logs, in the AWAF log and also APM log. Anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.